Do you think we should wait
Okay,
until?
good afternoon, everyone. I think in the essence of time, we'll go ahead and get started. I know some of you are still getting lunch, but we can start with some of the things that we need to do before we get started with the talk. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I'm Dr. Gayatri Jayashankar. I'm one of the general pediatricians at ETSU. It is exciting that we're starting off a new session of the Spring Grand Round schedule, and I hope everybody got a copy of that in the email. If you haven't, please contact CME at ETSU, and they will put you on the mailing list for the spring schedule. As you may know before, what we do to get CME credit for the event is to call in to that number. It's also in the back of the room, but this is really for those in this room. I know we have some remote sites watching in, and the number won't work from a remote site. This number here is for the people watching in this room. Call 423-200-3259, and the event ID today is 8011. I also see evaluation forms at the tables. Please make sure you complete your evaluations at the end of the session, because that is what will keep our CME going. Again, welcome everyone to Peds Grand Rounds. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shannon Ross-Sheehy here with us from the Department of Psychology. Dr. Sheehy went did her master's from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in developmental psychology, and then went on to get her doctoral degree from the University of Iowa in developmental psychology back in 2005. After that time, she worked at the University of Iowa for many years doing postdoc research and held several posts before joining us here in August of 2013 in the Department of Psychology. She currently has a grant in the Department of Psychology in using eye movements to assess functional brain development in infants, has done a whole lot of work and research in this area in infants. Her CV reads 13 pages long, has numerous publications, presentations, and really is a wonderful expert, and I'm very excited to listen to her talk on using infant visual attention to assess cognitive development in term babies as well as in preterm infants. Dr. Ashi.
Thank you. Oops. How's sound? Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm happy to be here to talk about my work using visual attention to assess functional brain development and visual attention in full and preterm infants. So I have no significant financial interest to disclose. As you all know, probably more than most, infant neural development is very rapid, and infant brains are incredibly plastic the first year of life. In fact, synaptic connections in infants, a measure of cortical connectedness, outnumber adults by a factor of 2 to 1. Unfortunately, most of this rather stunning plasticity is lost by the time infants are able to speak. So if we could catch these minute anomalies in brain function early in infants, when the brain is still maximally plastic, we could potentially ameliorate the root causes of cognitive deficit before the brain's learning networks have become hardwired. So that's sort of the goal of the work that I'm going to present today. Unfortunately, as again you probably all know more than most, current neurocognitive assessment tools are less than ideal. Partly because they rely heavily on motor development to assess cognitive development. And this is particularly problematic for high-risk infant populations. These tests aren't reliable for infants younger than 9 months. The tasks are kind of difficult. They require time and sustained attention on the part of the infant. And the tests themselves can actually be difficult. So for example, if you require failure a certain number of times in a row before you progress to the next level, this is kind of a confounding factor. And it's unpleasant. And as somebody who's worked with infants for many years, happy baby equals good data. So these are significant factors. And the tests themselves, they're kind of difficult. So if you've ever administered a Bailey's, it can be kind of difficult to administer. So if we were to construct an ideal list of everything we'd want an assessment task to be, there'd be a whole lot of things that we'd put on it. So it would be inexpensive and portable, it'd be quick and enjoyable for infants, it would be appropriate for all ages, not just 9-month-olds and up. It would be not too tied to culture or context. It wouldn't rely on language or training or conditioning. These are all sort of problems that current tasks have. It would allow for deep data collection, so we want to be able to get lots of data points from each individual infant. And importantly, it would be objective. So we want measures that are truly objective. We don't want that subjective component when we're assessing an individual infant's neural functioning or cognitive development. So we want it to be objective, and we want experimenters and technicians to be able to do these things without a whole lot of training. So my work would suggest, actually, that eye movements are an ideal candidate for this kind of a task. And the reason, one of the reasons anyway, is that the eyes really are an ideal window to the brain. So visual experience has a profound effect on the wiring of the brain, and not just in visual areas. Infants spend the vast majority of their day looking from one completely novel object, person, event to another. And the effect of this constant stream of new information is profound. So it has a profound effect on early learning. I'm sorry, my mic is acting a little funky. It has a profound effect on early learning. So a typical 3-month-old infant makes about 1.7 saccades, or eye movements, a second. So that's actually 100,000 eye movements a day. And it's about the same as an adult. So by the time they're 3 months, they're actually able to work that machine very, very well. So each one of these saccades, every single time they move their eyes, they send this cascade of neural activation along really important visual cortical areas that feed attention, memory, and learning mechanisms. And visual attention is the gatekeeper of this learning mechanism. So early deficits in visual attention are critical. So let's take, for example, okay, so if we have that visual input mechanism that works really well in typically developing infants. Infants are moving their eyes a lot, they tend to look at novel things, and they do it pretty much the whole time they're awake. If we alter that learning mechanism even just slightly, so if we have an infant who was impoverished or malnourished or perhaps reared in an impoverished environment or maybe some sort of disease or prematurity, a drop in saccade rate from 1.7 to 1.3 may not sound like that big of a deal. But this tiny little change, this little difference in this learning mechanism, compounded day after day and week after week, can have a really profound effect on experience-dependent brain development. So this particular infant who dropped their saccade rate this little bit, by the time they're 6 months old, will have looked at an incredible 25, almost 2,500,000 fewer objects, events, and people. So that's a full 42 days behind their typically developing peers. So one little mechanism, one little perturbation can really add up over 3 months to a really big issue. So clearly we need to correct course really early. So early attentional deficits are critical. But I would also suggest that these early differences are very meaningful. And these unique deficits can be tied to very specific areas of brain development. And not just visual areas. And the reason is that attention and visual behavior and neural development are very tightly coupled. So as infants look around, they begin encoding objects that they're looking at in their visual scene. This encoding leads to changes in long-term memory and changes in neural development, which in turn influence attention and subsequent eye movements. So there's this cycle, this tight cycle between visual behavior, learning, and neural development. So I would suggest peaking at visual behavior at any point in development should give us a pretty good sense of how the neural system is doing, how functionally they're doing. So eye movements are a pretty easy, quick thing to look at. So I've talked a lot about attention, I've talked a lot about eye movements. I'm using these terms sort of subjectively. So let me take a step back and tell you exactly what I mean by attention. So you probably all have a sense of what attention is. When I think of attention, not at work, I think of what my kids aren't doing at school, or I think of kind of focused information processing. But in cognitive science, it means something quite different. So attention is a set of cognitive operations that allow us to efficiently deal with the information overload that's basically present every minute of every day in our stimulus environments. So at any given moment, in vision, for example, there's far more visually than we can ever hope to deal with, to pay attention to learn about. And visual attention sort of offers this mechanism to assign priorities to different things. So we have this subjective sense that we're actually seeing the whole visual world, but in reality, we're seeing a very, very constrained small subset of it. So this is what attention is. It's kind of driving the machine that creates this sense of reality that we're seeing. So change blindness, and I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's a lot of pretty funny and interesting demos of this on YouTube. Change blindness is a demonstration of an attentional fail, like an attentional failure. And it's an example of what happens when you're presented with too much information at once and you can't possibly pay attention to it all and you can't process it all. So I'm going to show you these demonstrations, and what you're going to see, maybe you've seen these 100 times before. You're just going to see two images flickering on the screen. It's the same image, but one object has changed. So it's going to be flashing on and off. Your job is just to look at the image and just raise your hand when you see what's changing. Okay, so don't say it out loud because it'll ruin it for the people who can't see it. And I don't know if we're going to have some interesting lighting effects or visual angle effects, but just watch the video and raise your hand when you can see what's changing, okay? Okay, some people are seeing it. So once you see it, you're like, duh, how did I miss that, right? So others are still not seeing it? Okay, almost everybody now. So it's the light post in the middle that's between the two sides. So in one scene it's there, in one scene it's not. So your sense as you're looking at this is that you're seeing everything and you're not missing anything, but you're actually missing something kind of big. So here is another example of that, and I made these demos many, many years ago, so my kids are much older now. Raise your hand when you see it. So for some people this is really dramatic, for others they cannot see it at all. I've had to point this one out more than it. So, okay, so this actually has a little bit to do with working memory as well. Okay, so I will point out that it is the shirt, the color of the shirt. That's a big change. I mean, that's a pretty big attentional failing. And you are an adult with a fully functioning visual attention system. Infants are in a really different position. So they're trying to learn about this world that's almost completely foreign to them, using a machine that doesn't work this well. So there's a whole bunch of things working together with this kind of a demo. We feel like we do it very well. Infants are really just learning how to do it. So it's not just that attention helps us create our sense of what's happening in the world around us right now. There's also this competitive process. It's not a unitary thing that flips on and off perception. It's this whole series of events that work together, and it's a competitive process. So this is an example of a really attention-demanding task we all do every day, and it helps people really understand what I'm talking about. So driving is very attention-demanding. You may not remember that because it's probably very automatic for most of you now. But if you think back to when you were learning to drive, I bet you can remember having trouble keeping the wheel straight or having trouble remembering which foot, which pedal, or which gear if you were learning on a standard. I explicitly remember having trouble if the music was on. I just found that so overwhelmingly distracting, I would have to turn the music off. Now I open my eyes and my car is at work and I have no memory of how I did that. But attentionally, I'm still all there. I'm just not encoding everything I'm seeing. So what happens when we're driving is actually this cascade of events that are occurring so fluidly and so efficiently, we don't even know that they're happening. Until something goes wrong with the process, we're not even aware of it at all. So you're driving down the road, and in this situation, most likely your attention is pretty focused on what's happening in front of you. So this, especially if you're in tight traffic, you want to focus your attention on what's happening right in front of you because you want your eyes in the most important location of the visual field. If the brake lights were to suddenly flick on, you'd want to be able to hit the brake and stop as quickly as possible. If you're looking somewhere else, or if you're not paying attention, you could crash. So the stakes are pretty high. You want your attention really focused in front. But you don't want to be so focused that you're insensitive to other things. So you don't want to be so focused on that motorcycle in front of you that you don't notice if a child were to run out from the side of the street or a ball were to roll out in front of the car. That is a separate attentional mechanism. There's sort of an interrupt thing that happens when unexpected events happen in the peripheral vision that causes this automatic shift of attention and a subsequent eye movement. So like I said, we do that maybe millions of times a day, constantly. We're not aware of this competition. You want to be focused on what's happening in front of you, but you want to be sensitive here. So you have to have a good control of this mechanism. And kids who are struggling, really sensitive to peripheral events may have trouble focusing. They're related. They're separate but related. So infants, that interplay between what they're currently paying attention to and what kind of calls for an interrupt signal is developing. And these systems develop at different rates, and it causes changes in the visual behavior. So you may wonder how I could possibly measure attention in babies, and fortunately, it's actually pretty easy. So for adults, we can ask them to do all kinds of really complicated things. We have a postdoctoral attention researcher here who works with adults and can attest to that. But we can't do much with babies. We can't instruct them. We can't tell them to look at a fixation cross. We can't even strap their little awake heads into a magnet and do an MRI. We're pretty limited with what we can do. But what we can do is measure what they're looking at. Fortunately, what infants are looking at is a really good index of what they had just paid attention to. And this is true with adults too. So in typical visual viewing, your visual sequences happen like this. You're focusing on something, attention shifts, your eyes follow, attention shifts, your eyes follow. So there's this volley, this interplay between attention and eyes. It's usually pretty tightly coupled. And that's true for babies as well. So we can use eye movements as a proxy for where attention had been. So it's actually pretty convenient. And it's pretty easy. So this is a typical 5-month-old. And they have like these beautiful eye movements. They have giant eyes, they have big shiny corneas, which are actually really great for eye tracking, and they have huge pupils. And if they're interested in what you're showing them, they'll sit pretty still. So it's not hard at all. It takes a little bit of training. I don't want to say it's nothing. But it's pretty easy to look at infant eyes like that and very reliably say when they've moved from one location to another. It's really doable. So that basically is kind of what I'm going to talk about today. This whole talk boils down to measuring what infants do when they move their eye, under what conditions they move their eyes from here to here, and how quickly it changes. So I developed a task that will help me do this. It's the Infant Orienting with Attention, or the aptly named Iowa task. Yes, I'm actually from Iowa. Yes, I saw the game. No, I don't want to talk about it. It was awful. So the Infant Orienting with Attention task is just a series of cued attention trials. So if you've read any attention work, it's really just a basic idea. I have a set of different visual attention conditions that set up these different competitions. So just like the driving, competition between what's happening in front and what's happening in the periphery. We set up a whole bunch of different conditions that kind of mimic that. So we want to see how quick infants are to shift their attention, what influences that, and how does that develop. So that's really key. That's everything. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the task and the specifics of the task. And just please jump in and ask me questions, because I'm covering it pretty simply and quickly because I don't think it matters that much. But stop me if I'm covering something too quickly. Okay, so one of the great things about the Iowa task is we can break performance across all these different conditions and look to see when performance changes. And each one of these different conditions is really kind of targeting a different area of development. So we can look at these different subscales and get a sense of the whole picture of infant development. So this task is suitable for use with all ages and abilities. I've tested it with infants and with elderly people, with children. I've tested it with preterms, and preterms as young as corrected ages of 2 months. 1 month, actually. I don't know how great that data was, but you can get reliable eye movements from healthy, corrected age 1-month-old infants. And soon to be doing it with Reese monkeys. So lots of different data to look at. And it pretty much works the same for all ages. And that's one great thing, to be able to compare performance in one task developmentally across a whole range of development. That's pretty unique. And it allows for deep data collection. So it just so happens that babies love looking at these trials. They'll look at them a pretty long time, and I can easily get 60, 70, 80, sometimes more trials per infant. So that boosts my confidence about what I'm actually measuring. So here's an example of one of the trials. And it's pretty much the same setup for all the trials. I'm not sure how well you can see any of this, so I'll walk you through it. So the first thing infants see is this. That's our fixation cross. It's a smiley face that moves and dances, and there's actually music that plays. Something that's really interesting, gets the babies looking at the center of the screen. Once the infant is looking at the center of the display, the experimenter presses a button to start the trial, and the next 3 things happen very rapidly. So first, the infant is presented with a spatial cue paired with an auditory cue. So it's just a little black dot with a beep. Happens very, very quickly. It's only 100 milliseconds. And the location of that dot is what we vary. So 100 millisecond spatial and auditory cue, followed by a 100 millisecond delay here. And finally, the presentation of a target. So the targets are all just everyday objects, colorful, varied, the kinds of things that babies like to look at. So from the moment we start the trial until the presentation of the target is about 200 milliseconds. And it's much faster than an infant can actually move their eyes. So we can get all of these things presented before the infant is actually able to program and move their eyes. Okay, and that's important. So in this particular condition, this would be a valid cue condition. We present the target, or the spatial cue, in the same location of the target. So in this situation, if infants have that interrupt signal the way adults do, if they could see that rolling ball when they were focusing on the motorcycle in front of them, then the presentation of this tiny little black cue, even for just 100 milliseconds, should be enough to elicit an automatic shift of attention. So their attention should automatically shift to that spatial location, and they should be in the process of programming up an eye movement by the time the target appears. So all they have left to do in this stream of events is actually execute that eye movement. So they should be really quick for conditions like this, compared to conditions where there's no cue at all. Does that make sense? So if they have that spatial attention, if they're sensitive to those spatial attention cues, it should automatically cause a shift of attention to that location, and it should speed up those eye movements to that location. Very straightforward. This is a facilitation effect, and that is a valid trial. So that's one of 5 different conditions we have. I apologize, I'm getting over the sickness as well. Another example of one of our basic trials is to present this cue on the other side of the display. So if instead of presenting it on the left, where the target appears, we present it on the right-hand side, and then the target appears on the left, we should expect the eye movement to be slower, but only if they have that spatial attention. So we present the cue over here, attention is automatically shifted over there. We present the target over here before they can move their eyes, but now they have 3 things they have to do. They have to stop programming this eye movement, execute another shift of attention, program and move their eyes. So they should be really slow for those invalid cue conditions. But again, only if they can see that little black pre-cue, and only if they're sensitive to those interrupt signals, I guess I'm calling them. So if they can't see the cues, or if they don't have sufficiently developed spatial attention, their looking should be equal across those 2 conditions. Those are the 2 main spatial cueing conditions. The third one is when we present 2 black cues at the same time. So this causes visual competition, and this sort of touching a whole different brain area. So adults, if you're driving down the road and 2 balls roll out in front of the street in front of you, what happens is a kind of freezing effect. So there's this visual competition, there's no easy winner, there's no easy perceptual kind of bottom-up winner. So what happens is a slowed eye movement while it waits for more information, okay? So typically, an adult would be slow to move their eyes when you present 2 cues followed by 1 target. But it requires really good cross-callosal talk. I mean, there has to be sufficient sort of bilateral neural development. So that's getting at something a little different. Okay, those are the 3 main tasks. We have 2 other baseline tasks. I'm probably making it sound more complicated than it is, but this is what it looks like actually in the wild. And the data I'm going to present today is not eye tracking data, but I took this from our eye tracker. So the red dot is the actual point of gaze of a 5-month-old infant who is in this task. And you can see how quickly the trials proceed. They look to the center, the experimenter starts a trial, you see a cue and then a target, and then the infant moves their eyes. So you can sort of see the different cue conditions. Actually, the frame grabber I used had a really low frame rate, so you might not see all the spatial cues. But you can at least see some of them. So that was a valid cue. That was another valid cue. That was an example of an invalid cue. We didn't see any cue there. That's one of the baseline conditions, and so on. So if we watch long enough, we'd see a double cue condition where 2 black dots appeared. So each one of these different trial types elicits a different system. Okay, so that is exactly how I tested the infants. This first sample I'm going to talk about are full-term infants. They were 5, 7, and 10 months old. There were 72 of them. And each one of these infants saw up to 70 unique attention trials. So we brought infants into the lab, we set them on their parents' lap in front of the computer monitor, we showed them this trial, and we measured their eye movements. And what we took from those eye movements were the speed of the eye movement, so how quickly they moved their eyes to the target once the target was presented, and the accuracy. So did they actually look at the target, or did they look somewhere else? So typically, if an infant got a trial wrong, they were looking at the cue, and it was an invalid cue condition, okay? So we frame by frame coded these data, which actually ends up being on par or not more reliable than eye tracking, because we have very few drop trials. The spatial, the temporal frequency, the temporal sort of precision is on par with a lot of entry-level eye trackers, and it's easier to do. I use eye tracking now, but I have a much better eye tracker. And with these speed and accuracy measures, we calculated spatial attention scores. So we're interested in sort of mean overall differences in age. We want to know what develops spatially with attention. We want to know what develops with their eye movements. But I'm also really interested in sort of individual differences in specific pieces of spatial attention. So that's what I really focus on. Okay, so starting first with speed and accuracy. These graphs are complex, a little bit noisy, and my animations are broken on this slide, and I didn't have time to recreate it. So let me just visually, verbally guide you through what I want you to pay attention to. Okay, so this is reaction time. On the x-axis here, we have the different cue conditions. These are the valid cue trials. I don't know if you can see it. Double cue trials here. Tone cue is a baseline, so there's no spatial cue at all, just the same tone that all the other trials had. And the invalid cue on the far right here. On the y-axis is reaction time in milliseconds. And as you look at this, what you can see right away is we have a really robust condition effect. So this manipulation, valid versus invalid versus double, had a really strong effect on infant looking. So they were really reacting to these trials very, very differently. So overall, all of the infants were the fastest to the valid trials. So trials where they got that valid spatial cue. They were all slowest to the invalid trials. And there's some really interesting interactions and differences on the in-between trials. And I'm going to focus on those in just a little bit. But for now, suffice it to say, we get a really nice, strong strong trial of condition effect here. And you can just make out a developmental effect as well. So in general, as expected, 5-month-olds were slower than the 7-month-olds who were slower than the 10-month-olds. Though the 5-month-olds are pretty darn fast. That actually surprised me how close they were to the older infants. So these are the overall mean numbers. This is just reaction time, and it is one of the things I'm interested in, and it's kind of a gross way of looking at, I guess, overall functioning of at least the ocular motor system. But I'm very, very interested in these individual differences between specific conditions, okay? But these are important. It was important to first demonstrate that the task works and that we see a nice developmental effect. So these are all correct trials only. When we look at percent correct, or the error rate, this is percent correct here, we see also interesting condition effects. So again, condition is along the x-axis here, and we can see that all of the infants, regardless of age, were near ceiling for the tone cue condition and the valid cue condition. So again, the tone cue is a baseline condition. It's how infants look when we don't cue them at all spatially. So we use that as a basis of comparison. So in those conditions where there's no visual competition of any kind, infants are very, very accurate, near ceiling in fact. When we look at the double cue condition, we see about a 15% or more performance hit. So they're getting quite a few of those wrong. So at least-ish 15% of the time when they're presented with 2 cues, they're kind of gambling, programming as a cat, and going to the wrong side. But they're still doing pretty well. In the invalid cue condition, we see performance takes a significant dive, and in fact, down near chance for some of these infants. So it's a crapshoot. About half the time, they're looking at the cue, and they make the wrong bet. So here we also see these interesting developmental effects, where the 5-month-olds actually look a little better with respect to percent correct, than the older infants. And this is interesting. It may have more to do with how quickly 5-month-old infants can program and execute a saccade than interesting spatial abilities. But more on that later. So I want to turn now to the spatial attention measures. And these, I'm just picking a few of them, and I don't want it to be too bogged down with details. So I'm going to breeze through it, and again, please raise your hand and ask me a question if I'm skipping some critical piece of information. And that goes for my students as well, because they know I have a tendency to breeze through that stuff. Okay, so to measure spatial attention, what I have to do is look at the relative benefit or the relative cost of those cues. So I have these baseline cue conditions, these tone cue conditions. I want to look to see how much the valid cue sped up looking time relative to baseline, and how much the invalid and double cues hurt reaction time with respect to baseline. That's essentially all I'm doing. The other benefit of creating these individual spatial attention scores is that each infant gets their own set of scores. They're totally, almost completely independent. So an infant can be really high in one kind of spatial attention and low in another. And they're free from the confounding effects of individual differences in kind of mean reaction time. So some babies just come out of the chute faster at moving their eyes than others. And it's important that we're looking at percent changes. So these spatial attention scores kind of give us all of that. And it's a little bit easier way to think about it, I think. So we can normalize those differences between valid and baseline and invalid and baseline and create these attention scores. That is all they are. So we just are subtracting the condition that we're interested in. We're subtracting essentially baseline from the condition that we're interested in. And what's left is that little bit of facilitation or that little bit of interference that's driven just by that particular cue. Does that make sense? Okay. So as sensitivity to these spatial cues increase, so young infants are a little sensitive to these cues, older infants and adults are very sensitive. And as that sensitivity increases, those attention scores increase as well. So if there's no difference, if they're equally as fast looking among all the conditions, then those scores should all go to 0. So we can actually compare them to 0 to get a sense of how our typical infant's doing. Okay, so starting first with cue facilitation, and this is just very simply the difference in looking time from valid and baseline. So it's literally just the normalized difference, the speed up or that enhancement from the valid cue condition. How much benefit is that valid spatial cue? How much are they using that? How much are they benefiting from it? And what you can see is a robust facilitation even at our youngest ages. Even the 5-month-old infants are showing significant facilitation when we present a valid spatial pre-cue. When we look at cue interference, the same measure with the invalid cue, we see a slightly different picture. So we're kind of getting at different abilities. So some infants are showing a big cost of having a tricky invalid cue. Other infants aren't showing as big of a cost. So in particular, the 5-month-olds, they are significantly different from 0, but they're not showing a huge amount of interference effects from this invalid cue. 7-month-olds show a little bit more, and the 10-month-olds are back down again. So we get this kind of interesting curvilinear trend. And when we look at the cue competition scores, this is a measure of the slowdown when we present 2 cues at once. That's that extra complex visual competition condition. Here, this is what really pulls them apart. And this is true in this sample, this is true in several other samples that I have, and it's true in the preemie sample that I'm going to talk about as well. There's something about that double cue condition that really pulls apart individual differences in infants. So infants may look pretty typical with respect to cue facilitation, and they may be okay with the interference score, but when we look at their cue competition score, they just fall apart. There's something about being presented things multiply that really throw them off. So what we see here with this, these are typically developing infants, is the 5-month-olds are very low, but we see a massive boost for the older infants. So whereas the young infants don't show a huge response to being presented things multiple items at once, the older infants are very sensitive to that. And what happens is it slows their eye movements down. And that is a mature response. We do want eyes, we want to be able to perceive both things simultaneously. That's the first thing that has to happen. and when we want to be able to withhold an eye movement until we have some top-down information. So interesting developmental effects. And when we look at the babies individually, these are where the effects really pop out. I don't have much of that to talk about today, but I'm going to start talking a little bit about it. Okay, developmentally, what we found in general is all groups of infants showed significant spatial attention, even the youngest infants. They showed robust facilitation for the valid cues, interference for the invalid cues. All infants showed significant multi-item inhibition. So when we presented them that double cue condition, they all did show some sensitivity to it. But the 5-month-olds showed significantly less than the older infants. So this is definitely something that is increasing, something that substantially improves between 5 and 7 months. It's a pretty tight window. We also see marked increases in variability. I didn't really touch on that, but if you were looking at those error bars, you probably noticed. We see marked increases in variability, cueing, and competition effects at 7 months. So the 7-month-olds are kind of interesting, and I do a lot of working memory assessment as well, and they're interesting in working memory as well. So there's neurally interesting things going on around 6 and 7 months that lead to these interesting points of change. Okay. So the question is, can we use this task to assess atypical development? So we know it's sensitive to individual differences. We know it's sensitive to developmental changes. Can we use this as an index for development in atypical populations? So thinking back now about saccade rates and differences in early learning, a typical full-term infant has a pretty typical visual environment. So it may be different caregivers, it may be different numbers of caregivers or different environments, but they may be breastfeeding or bottle feeding. But this scenario, baby in arms, visual attention with parent, is pretty typical, and they get a lot of that. And on the right-hand side, we have a preterm infant that's actually a big, pretty healthy preterm infant. But even in this sort of best-case scenario, you can see the visual environment's very, very different. So right out of the chute, I mean, this baby's also probably quite a bit younger gestationally than this other infant. So they have these maturational differences, but they're also kind of thrust into this different visual environment. And as we know, differences in saccade rate, differences in environment have a huge effect on what follows, the visual learning and cognitive development downstream. So I really wanted to look at preterm infants, particularly with this functional attentional stuff. So this is work that I conducted in collaboration with the University of Iowa Children's Hospital. And I worked in their high-risk follow-up clinic. And I think you all have something pretty similar to that here. And so what the follow-up clinic was is if infants were admitted to this program, they were followed every 3 months for the first 2 years of their life. And University of Iowa Hospital is a big tertiary care hospital. People from about 3 states would come. So it was a large cohort. So it was a big group, it was really variable, and we pretty much just tested everybody who came in the door. So qualifying events some of the events included a stay at the NICU, I can't read because it's so small, low gestational age, sepsis, IVH, etc. So several things. I'm sure you all have a similar system for qualifying. So we tested infants right there in the clinic, and we actually just pulled computers out of a storage room and pushed our little lab equipment in there. And infants where parents and children would come to the clinic, and different specialists would come see them. So they'd be there for hours and meet with everybody that was in their care schedule. So we would approach parents while they were waiting. If they were interested, we'd just pull them into the back room and test them right there on the spot. It actually ended up working really well. We had really high enrollment. Of the couple of hundred infants that I tested there, only one parent opted out, and it was because their infant was fussing. And all of them said something like, happy to help other parents in this situation. It was really a great experience. So it worked really well. Testing takes about 10 minutes. So other work that's currently ongoing there at the hospital is looking at the utility of Iowa as an outcome measure. So I did some of that with this first sample. I'm not going to be able to talk about any of that today, but we did see some really interesting relations between performance on specific attentional subscales and unique aspects of infant morbidity. So that's all interesting and fun to talk about, and I'd be happy to chat about that after. But in this cohort, we're looking very specifically at liberal versus conservatively transfused preemies who are in the NICU there, and we're following them for other reasons as well, but we're using the Iowa test to assess changes in functional brain development. So we're also getting MRIs, so we're going to be able to start looking at least sort of gross structural and maybe DTI measures that map onto Iowa performance. So that is ongoing. So this first sample, we tested 48 healthy preterm infants, or the sample that I'm going to talk about. And they were in the age range of 5 or 10 months corrected. So we used their corrected ages, though that also is an interesting debatable point, and I've looked at the data both ways, and I'd be happy to chat about that more later if anybody is interested. In general, this was a pretty healthy sample. So,
We can't hear you anymore. I was just going to check your mic.
how's that? Can you hear me now? Mic is not working.
I think it just shut off. I don't think it's out of allergies, but it's saying they just have to speak.
Should I grab this one?
No, that's for the recording. I think that's the battery died.
Okay.
Do you want me to look for some more batteries?
I can try to talk loud. I'm happy to talk loud. If you guys are okay with that. I can talk loud. I usually teach very large lecture courses. Okay, so this actually, can you hear me when I talk like this? Maybe it's more interesting anyway. I have to kind of yell. It's more attention grabbing. Okay, so this was a pretty healthy sample. Mean time on the vent, there was a huge range here, 5 to 97 days. Mean birth weight, again, massive variability there, but around 2,000 grams. They all, 4 of them had ROPs of stage 1 or 2, and that's because I excluded any infants who had 3 or greater. And 3 of them had IVHs of stage 1. Again, I excluded stage 2 and higher. So pretty healthy sample. Okay, just for comparison, I'm tossing in a sample of full-term infants. There are 48 of them. Again, they're 5 and 10-month-olds. No significant birth complications, no pre- or postnatal medical conditions. Okay, so healthy sample, greater than 37 weeks. Okay, so instead of going through their scores bit by bit or Q by Q or trial by trial, I'm going to just give you the gross overall scores. So I hopefully can save a little more time for discussion at the end. So I'm going to look at gross mean measures of speed and accuracy this time. Okay, so starting first with reaction time. Across the x-axis here, I have age, so that's 5 and 10 months, and reaction time in milliseconds on the y-axis. Looking first at the young infants, these are the 5-month-olds, we can see that the preterm infants were significantly slower than the full-term infants. So again, these are age-corrected preterms. So they're kind of super as far as their visual experience is concerned. Most of them had at least 1 or 2 months more visual experience. So it's significant to me that they're actually pretty delayed in their visual saccade rate. So here we have that decrease in saccade rate. When we look at the infants at 10 months, that difference goes away. So this is comforting. They start off with some pretty significant deficits, but they seem to resolve for the most part by the time they're 10 months old. When we look at error rate, we see kind of an interesting null effect. So the preemies actually look pretty good with respect to error rate. They look pretty much like full-term infants. So they don't make significantly more errors, but maybe more importantly, they don't make significantly fewer errors. So they are seeing the cue. They are looking inappropriately to the cue during the double and no cue condition. We know that they're visually able to see everything. So they actually look pretty good. Surprisingly, they look really good. So what about spatial attention? This is where kind of all the meaty stuff is that I'm particularly interested in, that I think is most telling. When we look at cue sensitivity, and it's just a combination of the facilitation and the interference altogether. It's just an easier way to think about it. When we look at cue sensitivity, a measure of how sensitive they are to those spatial pre-cues, 5-month-olds look all right. So they don't show a huge amount of this cue sensitivity, but neither do typically developing infants. But when we look at the 10-month-old infants, whoops, sorry about that, we see a significant difference, a pretty big significant difference. So now the preemies, by the time they're 10 months old, they're okay with respect to error rate, they're okay with respect to reaction time, but we're showing this very specific spatial attention deficit. And it's pretty advanced by the time they're 10 months old. When we look at cue competition, the measure of what happens when we present 2 things at once, looking first at 5 months, again, they're pretty low, just like typically developing infants. But when we look at 10-month-olds, we're now seeing this really big deficit. So the preterm infants are actually showing huge delay with respect to this multi-item competition. And that's actually a really important piece of visual attention because we're confronted with these things every minute of every day. So being able to deal with multiple inputs happening simultaneously means being able to like handle it, solve it, and look quickly around a room or look quickly around while you're driving. Preemies are looking like not very good at that. So what it means is they're not detecting multiple items being presented simultaneously. They don't seem to be showing sensitivity when we present them two things at once. They're either treating it like a valid cue and getting it right, or they're treating it like an invalid cue and getting it wrong. They seem to be almost simultagnosic. They're only able to attend to one thing at a time. So that is very interesting to me. And like I said, this is one of the measures that really seems to pull kids out individually. So key findings here, like full-term infants, preterm infants improve steadily over the first 12 months. So we're seeing developmental improvement, an appropriate level of developmental improvement, particularly with respect to reaction time and accuracy. However, the preterm infants have markedly lower cue sensitivity and cue competition scores relative to full-term infants. So one caveat. This isn't exactly the kind of experimental control that I typically have in my lab. The age ranges were a little larger. And one interesting effect that I would really like to replicate, I would like to rule out as an alternative explanation, is that the older infants who came into the clinic, at least in my sample, tended to be the sicker ones. So they tended to be parents who didn't drop off the radar, who were still concerned, who still wanted a lot of follow-up. So it wasn't a huge effect in that first year, but I actually have data from several 1 to 2-year-olds, and that was a massive. I couldn't even look at that data. It was totally confounded. But very interesting and suggestive. Okay, so that brings me to my current project. I'm actually just going to talk about it because ETSU Peds is involved with this. Dr. Karen Skitsina, I think I'm always pronouncing it wrong, but that was all right. So I have a hard last name too, so I'm very sensitive to it. But actually, you pronounced it just right, Ross Sheehy. ETSU Peds is actually helping with this current recruitment project. So this grant has been recently funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the call for the application was to explore new ways to measure fetal and infant brain development. So phase 1 of this project, which is happening now, and we desperately need babies for this phase, is to collect longitudinal data from infants at 5, 8, and 11 months of age. And we're bringing them into the lab. So we're bringing the same infant back 3 times. We want to really see how these measures change with development. And we're getting a whole array of assessments. So we're doing the Iowa task. I have a really fancy, nice eye tracker now, so we'll see if that helps or hurts. We'll see how that goes. We're doing Iowa attention measures. We're doing visual working memory measures. And I'm doing measures of visual scanning. So I'm just going to go ahead and look at actual scan rate and see how that maps onto everything. We're also going to be collecting concurrent measures of pupillary reactivity while they're engaged in these tasks, so sort of task-dependent pupil responses, which is a measure of mental effort. And we're also collecting concurrent ECG. So that one we're excited about. That's pretty new. But that's going on right now. And we're also just grabbing a whole bunch of measures from the parents. So we're interested in prenatal stress. We're interested in postpartum depression. We're interested in maternal health and fetal health in general. So we're kind of grabbing every measure that we can. So phase 1 is happening now and for the next 18 months. Phase 2 for the project is aimed at developing a portable version of the Iowa task that can be used on iDevices and normalizing the task on many, many babies. So that's an important next step if we want to use this as an assessment tool. I have data on at least 4 separate samples, but I'd like to normalize it on a massive, large sample and begin testing.
Mean ECG as an electrocardiogram or
Yes.
something?
Yes. Yes.
What do you want to see? Heart rate?
We're looking at, so initially we were interested in heart rate defined sustained attention. So heart rate changes reflect mental effort, particularly in visual attention tasks. But we're interested in other maybe event-related changes in waveforms or wave components or any number of things, actually.
You need a cardiologist.
I actually had that in my talk, and maybe I haven't gotten to it yet, but we're collecting ECG and we're open to suggestions because we're going to have all this data. And I have this fantastic software that I've spent way too many hours just playing with now. So there's a lot of interest in it. I will talk to you after. That'd be great. So we're going to begin testing in developing countries. We're starting with Ethiopia, and that actually is happening now, and the rhesus monkey project as well. So the idea, one of the other projects, it's a different group, it's Oregon Health Sciences University. We're looking at NIRS, so near infrared spectroscopy, with infants awake performing the Iowa task. And we're going to look at cortical connectivity and patterns of network development. So we've got all these different prongs that are hopefully kind of bring us back to particularly what specific areas of the brain are developing and how that's reflected in the different subscales. So this is like some of the ECG data that we get. So lots of fun stuff to play with. And our eye tracker, this is exactly what it looks like for an infant. They're not usually sitting so close. But it's a very simple task in the lab. In conclusion, attention and eye movements reflect functional brain development in several key cognitive areas. Eye movements are easy and cheap to measure and provide detailed insight, or at least can provide detailed insight into the developing mechanisms of attention. And the Iowa task itself can provide sensitive attentional scores for each infant. It allows for direct comparison between individual infants free from the confounding effects of reaction time differences. It can be used to assess development in typical and atypical populations. And now we just need a whole bunch of babies to really get this phase 1 of this Gates project off the ground. And I also do want to thank the RDC committee. This was also funded by an RDC grant that we wouldn't have been able to get as far as we are in data collection now without that. That's it. Thank you. Done. And I'm happy to answer questions or chat about findings that I have.
Unfortunately, Northeast Tennessee has the highest incidence of drug-exposed infants in almost the whole country. Is there, I think it would be fascinating to do these kind of studies in that population group, and all kinds of altered state awareness, et cetera. So,
What's your name? You may be one of the people I have been wanting to reach out to talk about that. But yes, in person. Yes, I'm very interested in that. And I have every reason to believe that we could see, so one of the key things that you can get from this, I sound like I'm sort of tooting my own horn here, but one of the great things about this task is we can get measures very, very early. So we can start looking at these babies at 3, 4, 6 months and look to see what's changing. So if we have any reason to believe that there are changes in sort of baseline arousal rates definitely affect performance in this task, but any kind of visual attentional effects at all, it'd be interesting to see, and we could see that pretty early. Yeah?
for example, right now we have, I think, 12 to 13 drug-exposed infants in our NICU, so we have the numbers.
Right now, this,
Those are correct data.
wow.
Is there a mechanism, Dr. DeVoe, right now to follow up the NAS babies? There's not an NAS follow-up, or is there plans for that?
I know that one of our speech language people was applying for a grant from Iowa from that place, but it was not funded on us. So we know it's a need for it.
I have heard of that grant.
Great work. Awesome.
Thank you.
The question I have is regarding the stimulation and overstimulation, because I'm glad Karen is up here, or Kel is here. The thing is, we in a preterm, I'm a neonatologist and I work with Dr. DeVoe. We have a lot of issue regarding stimulating versus overstimulating. And I don't know, is there anything in your psychological literature regarding what's the limit? Because so many times I feel as a physician, we are limiting the opportunities that can be presented and telling the families back off, while they really needs these things on. And particularly from what you said, the attention can be from touch and sensory stimulation. And any comments on that?
Well, not in my direct line of work, but there has been a huge amount of work looking at sensory stimulation with preterm infants and optimal levels. And I'm not overly familiar with that, but they're definitely, obviously, in utero, they're getting all kinds of tactile sensory input. The visual thing is what's hard to control in NICU, and that's what they're sort of overexposed to very early on.
Because that's what I don't get it, because I thought that's more that you are, it's get better for your neural development, even the touch and these things, and I cannot perceive why it could be overstimulating and fatiguing.
Okay, here, I can speak a little bit to that. So absolutely, typical developing full-term infant, If they are overstimulated, they just kind of shut off. They'll fall asleep.
And
You
what
swap.
I just,
Exactly. The preemies, what's different is there's areas of the cortex, like particularly visual cortex, that are being overstimulated that shouldn't be. That's not in the typical developmental timeline. So in rat studies, rats are born with their eyes closed. They're born with their eyes closed, and olfactory cortex is the dominant cortical structure in a rat brain. If you force their eyes open, if you kind of cut them open when they're born and force them to have this visual experience they weren't supposed to have, they do see reductions in olfactory cortex. So it seems like there is a competition between sensory development where there's kind of a best fit for, there's a right fit for when to present things sensorily and when they're kind of expected maturationally. So I don't know of any studies that have looked at that specifically. But
I'm more interested with the tactile stimulation
Yeah.
versus non-tactile, because visual, everybody knows, and we do try to mimic the in-womb experience and try to cover up the things on. So that part, everyone knows, and most of the research agree on that aspect, that you don't want to overstimulate with the eyes and things on fatigue. As far as the sensory aspect, that I'm a little more interested in, try to know when you say that mother's touch to the baby, if you just take the term babies, it's now you're exhausting and overstimulating your baby versus I think now you should put your baby down. That's what I just don't get it. So
I don't know.
I want to get from your perspective.
I'm way out of my league there. I'm totally speculating. But I would suspect that there are physiological tells if an infant is getting overstimulated. So obviously, a mom holding a baby is mimicking some aspects of the in utero environment. If the baby's swaddled, I guess you can't really do that if they're cords and tubes coming out of everywhere. But if you're holding them tight and they're hearing the heartbeat and they're against the warm skin, that's great. I mean, I can't imagine that being, if they're able to move their arms freely and they're trying to do that, that is really not a typical. So I don't know, like if you just you have them hooked up to heart rate monitoring, is there any, I wonder if you could use that as an index of overstimulation.
But I know that it'll be so many times.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a,
I think a lot of times when that happens, it's responding to those physiological changes and they're showing some more autonomic instability and maybe not tolerating all of the levels of stimulation that are going around visual, auditory, tactile, and all of those things. I think that that's where some of that your baby's overwhelmed or overstimulated is.
So that is interesting, that integration of information from different sensory channels. So that is one thing that in my preemie sample came out pretty strongly. So I didn't go into the specifics of all the different trial types, but I have two different baseline conditions. One of them is the tone that's present in all the other conditions, because I want to see, I want them to be alert, I want them to be prepared for when the trial happens. So I hold that constant. But I want to see the effect of that tone, so I have one condition where there's no tone at all. So for typically developing infants, the tone always helps. They're always faster. They always use it as a timing cue. They immediately learn the connection between the presence of the tone, the spatial cue, and a target. But for my preemie sample, the tone completely disrupts their performance. So in the conditions where there's a tone presented, they're behaving in a really disorganized way. So this is one of those interesting things that I see that is really strong in some babies and not really present in others that I think might be meaningful, but I've never had enough data to be able to pull that out.
Probably habituated to all of the tones that they heard.
Oh, that's interesting.
Maybe that's why that's, I don't
No,
know.
that's interesting. I actually I assumed it was disruptive, but maybe it is a habituation effect. Or maybe their arousal is already so high, so low. One of the other things that I saw very clearly in the sample was really strong lateralization effects. So I can look at left-right visual field reaction time and sensitivity. And there would be, maybe 5% of the preemies that would show a really strong, almost looked blind on one side. No ROP, no evidence of visual issues at all. But attentionally, they don't show any evidence of sensitivity on one visual field. They were careful at that hospital. It's a big children's hospital about turning beds and talking to parents and shifting cords from one side to the other. But, that's one of the effects that I can see really clearly.
Any other questions before we disband? Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.